Have you ever noticed just this persistent background dissatisfaction in your life?
Oh, absolutely. Like a low-level hum.
Right, exactly. A hum, like the feeling, you hit your goals, you get the promotion, you find the relationship you've been looking for, and for a minute, everything is just perfect.
Yeah, you finally breathe out.
You do. But then, almost like clockwork, that restless, itching feeling just returns. It starts as a whisper and grows into this hum, and you're left sitting on your couch on a Tuesday night thinking, like, is this it? What's next? Why am I still not settled?
It's a very universal experience.
Really is. But what if I told you that the problem isn't that you aren't trying hard enough? What if the problem isn't that you just haven't found the right life hack or, the right morning routine or the right therapist?
The usual fixes.
Yeah. What if your entire approach to fixing yourself is structurally flawed from the ground up?
I mean, it's an incredibly confronting thought. We are just so deeply conditioned to believe that if we just find the right technique or the right mindset or even the right environment, that background hum of anxiety will finally permanently turn off.
Right.
But, the material we are diving into today suggests something far more radical. It suggests that the very tools we use to seek peace are the exact mechanisms keeping us trapped in the dissatisfaction.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today we are immersing ourselves in a deep dive into the philosophical framework of Acharya Prashant, which is often referred to as the AP framework in the sources.
Yeah, and it's a heavy one.
It is. And as we dig into these sources, it becomes immediately clear that this is just a rigorous, unapologetic dismantling of how we view the mind, reality, and, the pursuit of happiness.
It really pulls no punches.
Not at all. We are going to debunk the entire idea of enlightenment as some magical final destination you can arrive at. We are going to reveal why your mind is actually completely innocent of the crimes you constantly accuse it of.
That's a big one.
Yeah, and we'll explain why a self-proclaimed rationalist, the person demanding empirical, peer-reviewed evidence for absolutely everything, is often actually the most deeply superstitious person in the room.
And this is going to require leaving our philosophical comfort zones for sure. This framework does not coddle the reader.
No, it definitely doesn't.
It doesn't offer a 10-step plan to feel better about yourself. It operates like a surgical scalpel, just cutting away at the deepest assumptions we hold about who and what we are. So if you are listening to this right now, I want you to mentally prepare to have your fundamental sense of identity challenged.
Yeah, because the only place to start this surgery is with the diagnosis. The framework begins by looking straight at that observable fact we just talked about, human incompleteness.
That endless restlessness.
Exactly. And the root cause of this, according to the text, is the ego. But here's where we have to immediately stop and recalibrate, because they define the ego very differently than we usually do.
Right, the pop psychology definition.
Yeah, like if I say someone has a big ego, I'm usually talking about the guy at the gym who won't stop looking in the mirror, or a CEO who talks over everyone in a meeting.
Exactly. In our common language, ego is basically synonymous with arrogance, vanity, or selfishness. But the AP framework strips all of that behavioral baggage away entirely.
Okay, so how does it define it?
It redefines the ego, strictly, structurally, as the felt sense of I am X.
I am X.
Yes, and that X can be literally any object, quality, identity, or attribute in the universe.
So like, I am my career.
Right. Or I am a parent, I am an anxious person, I am a spiritual seeker, I am a victim. The ego is simply the basic structure of personal identity itself.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about being arrogant.
Not at all. Therefore, the meek, self-effacing, incredibly humble person who constantly apologizes for taking up space has an ego just as rigid and solid as the loud, boastful billionaire.
That is wild. They just have a different X.
Exactly. They just have a different X. The framework states that the ego isn't a physical substance you can find in the brain. It's an error in perception. It's a structural mistake in how we organize our experience of reality. And this psychological error has massive, devastating material consequences.
And what blew me away in the sources is where this error actually comes from. It doesn't come from bad parenting or a traumatic childhood.
Well, it goes way deeper than that.
It does. The framework argues that the origins of the ego are purely physiological. It is born from the body's skin boundary.
The literal edge of the body.
Right, the physical separateness of the organism from the rest of the physical world. You combine that distinct biological boundary with millions of years of evolutionary baggage, the imperative to survive, to consume, to defend.
All that animal programming.
Yeah, And that physical boundary creates the initial primordial split of I versus not I. Everything inside this skin is me, and everything outside this skin is the world, which is either a resource to be consumed or a threat to be avoided.
This is a profound starting point, because it means you are fighting millions of years of biological programming. The ego is the psychological translation of a physical reality.
Right.
And this brings us to what the framework brilliantly calls the first superstition. It points out a massive blind spot in modern secular thinking.
Oh, I loved this part, the rationalist stuff.
Yeah. Think about a hardcore rationalist. This is someone who prides themselves on using logic, science, and evidence to challenge all external beliefs. They debunk religion. They deconstruct tradition. They reject authority. They demand proof for everything.
Right, they're the ultimate skeptics. They won't believe a single claim unless you show them the data.
But the framework asks a devastating question. They examine everything, but do they ever examine the I that is doing the examining?
Wow.
They just implicitly assume that the examiner, the self, the ego, is real, solid, and self-evident. They strip away all these secondary external superstitions only to reveal the primary superstition in naked form.
Which is the unquestioned assumption that the I doing the thinking is a real, bounded, independent entity.
Yeah, exactly. You challenge the existence of God, you challenge the fabric of society, but you don't challenge yourself as the challenger. That, the framework argues, is the deepest superstition of all.
I hear that, and it's a fascinating philosophical trap to catch a rationalist in. But I have to push back here.
Sure, go ahead.
Because this sounds like we are spiraling into abstract philosophy that ignores biological reality. If the ego is just the basic sense of I, born from my skin boundary, isn't it completely necessary for survival?
Well,
Like, to use a really basic analogy, if I don't have an ego, if I don't have a distinct sense of I, how do I know whose mouth to feed at the dinner table?
that's a fair point.
Right. How do I stop myself from walking blindly into oncoming traffic? If I'm not an I, why would I look both ways before crossing the street?
It's a crucial question, and the framework actually doesn't dodge it at all. It addresses this biological imperative directly through a concept called the ego floor.
The ego floor.
Yes. The framework validates your analogy perfectly. The ego floor is defined as the irreducible minimum of ego that is fundamentally tied to your physical separateness. It is the baseline operating system of the organism.
Okay, so it's built in.
Right. And the text is brutally honest. As long as you are alive, as long as your body breathes and requires calories to function, that ego floor persists. You will always know whose mouth to feed.
Right, my hand will always pull away from a hot stove.
Exactly. The physical boundary demands that minimum level of self-preservation. So anyone, any guru, any mystic claiming to have entirely 100% eradicated their ego while still walking around in a physical body, eating food, and sleeping in a bed is structurally mistaken.
Yeah.
The ego floor is there until physical death.
Okay, that is a huge relief. So the framework isn't asking us to become functional zombies who can't operate a door handle?
No, not at all.
The problem then isn't the ego floor itself. The root of our suffering isn't that we know to feed our own mouths. The problem is what we build on top of that floor, right?
Exactly. The problem arises because the ego refuses to stop at the skin boundary. Remember that baseline incompleteness we talked about?
Yeah, that restless hum.
Right. The ego feels it profoundly. Because it is separate, it feels small, vulnerable, and restless. It looks at the vast universe and feels its own insignificance. So it tries to solve this agonizing sense of incompleteness by borrowing from the outside world.
Borrowing what, exactly?
It uses objects, statuses, wombs, and ideologies as scaffolding to build itself up, to make itself feel real, substantial, and permanent.
Scaffolding, I like that word.
It says, I am not just this fragile, dying body. I am the senior vice president title. I am this political affiliation. I am this righteous cause. I am this deep, unique trauma from my childhood.
Wow, so it takes all these external things and claims them.
It borrows all this external material, drags it inside, and declares it as its own core identity.
And this is where the suffering is manufactured, because if your entire identity is made of borrowed scaffolding, it is inherently unstable. It can always be knocked down by the world.
Precisely. Let's make this real for the listener. I want you to consider what specific scaffolding you are using to define yourself right now.
Right, everyone has something.
Maybe it's your intellect. Maybe it's your role as the reliable one in your family. Maybe it's your activism, your wealth, or even your identity as a good, moral person.
Oh, the good person one is so common.
It is. Now think about how terrifying it feels when that specific scaffolding is challenged. If you get fired from the job that defines you, or someone publicly questions your intelligence, or you fail to be the good person in a crucial moment, it doesn't just feel like you are losing a possession.
No, it feels like you're dying.
Yes.
Yeah.
It triggers a literal existential panic. Your heart races, your stomach drops, you feel like you are disappearing. That intense physiological panic is the ego scrambling to protect its borrowed identity. Because without that scaffolding, it feels like it is actually dying.
That is so universally relatable. I mean, I think about moments where I've been criticized in a meeting for an idea I pitched.
Right, just normal feedback.
Exactly. If I was just a biological organism, I would just take the feedback and adjust the work. But because my scaffolding is tied to, being the smart, creative one, a simple critique feels like a dagger to the chest.
It becomes a threat to your existence.
Yeah. I will argue, deflect, and ruin my own afternoon just to protect that mental tower. We spend our whole lives frantically defending these precarious towers from the wind. So if the ego is this structural error, this compulsion to build unstable scaffolding on top of our physical existence, how do we fix the dissatisfaction it causes? What is the solution?
Well, to understand the solution, we first have to examine the most common and the most fundamentally flawed strategy that humanity employs. The framework calls this the biggest lie humanity ever told itself.
The biggest lie. Okay.
And it uses a brilliant spatial metaphor to explain it.
Oh, this is the idea of the two axes, right? The framework introduces two different dimensions of movement in human life,
Yeah.
horizontal axis and the vertical axis.
Yes, let's break those down.
So the horizontal axis is the flat plane of change in the material and mental world. It's where almost all ordinary human activity takes place. Accumulating wealth, getting degrees, forming relationships, starting companies.
Basically, just life.
But crucially, it also includes things we think of as higher pursuits, like spiritual seeking, practicing extreme austerities, reading endless self-help books, going on silent retreats. On the horizontal plane, you are moving from point A to point B. Energy is spent, time passes, circumstances change, and you accumulate things, whether that's money or spiritual merit or new concepts.
And contrasted against that is the vertical axis. The vertical axis is entirely different. It is the axis of actual freedom, or what the framework terms ego thinning.
Ego thinning.
Yes, it has absolutely nothing to do with accumulating anything in the world. It has no interest in time, progress, or accumulation. And the ultimate lie, the great delusion that traps almost every human being, is summarized in a pseudo-mathematical equation. Y equals f of x.
Wait, walk me through the math metaphor. What does that actually mean in plain English?
It represents the false belief that varying your actions on the horizontal flat plane of the world, the x and z axis, will somehow magically create vertical lift, which is the y-axis.
So doing more horizontal stuff won't make you go up.
Exactly. It is the delusion that if I just arrange the furniture of my life perfectly on the horizontal plane, like if I get the right job plus the right spouse plus the right meditation technique, the sum of those horizontal achievements will somehow launch me upward into vertical freedom and lasting peace.
It's the if-then fallacy of human existence. If I just get this one more thing, then I will finally be complete.
Exactly. And the framework is merciless here. It states that both the ambitious shopkeeper working 80 hours a week to ruthlessly expand their business and the ascetic monk sitting in a freezing cave multiplying their fasting and breathing exercises are trapped on the exact same flat horizontal plane.
Wait, really? The monk and the shopkeeper?
From the outside, society views them as complete opposites. One is seen as worldly and greedy, the other is revered as spiritual and detached. But structurally, mechanically, they are identical. They are both operating under the y equals f of x z delusion.
Because they're both trying to accumulate something to feel better.
Exactly. They are both burning fuel to achieve a projected outcome, hoping that this horizontal movement will eventually yield vertical freedom.
It's like someone running at maximum speed on a treadmill in a basement, looking at the digital display, seeing they've run 10 miles, and wondering why they haven't reached the summit of the mountain yet.
That's a great analogy.
You're sweating, you're exhausted, you're putting in incredible amounts of work, and you feel a sense of progression, but you aren't actually gaining a single inch of elevation. But let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
Are you really saying the monk meditating on compassion and the CEO ruthlessly firing people for profit are in the exact same boat? Isn't the monk's activity at least objectively better for the world?
Well, on a societal level, yes, the monk might be less destructive. But the AP framework isn't interested in societal ethics. It is interested in structural liberation.
Oh, interesting distinction.
If the monk is meditating because he desires the identity of an enlightened being, he is just building spiritual scaffolding. His ego is just as dense, it's just wearing robes instead of a suit.
Wow. So what is vertical movement then?
Vertical movement is ego thinning. It is not the addition of new spiritual knowledge or better habits or more refined desires. It is the progressive reduction of the ego's density and weight.
Getting lighter.
Exactly. You don't gain vertical height by acquiring a shiny new identity as a mindful person. You gain height by stripping away the false identities you're already clinging to. You drop the heavy scaffolding, and by becoming lighter, you naturally rise.
And the text uses a really vivid mechanical metaphor for how we usually operate to try and get what we want, right? The internal combustion engine or the IC engine.
Yes, the IC engine metaphor is brilliant for explaining the mechanics of human drive. Think about how a car engine works. It requires a combustible fuel to create explosions in the cylinders, which drives the pistons and creates forward horizontal motion.
Makes sense.
In the human psychological machine operating on the horizontal plane, that highly combustible fuel is desire. Desire for money, desire for love, desire for revenge, desire for enlightenment. It's all just fuel poured into the tank. When the ego acts, it almost always acts because it desires a specific outcome to pad its scaffolding.
But here is where the framework completely flips our understanding of mental health and spiritual detachment. Sometimes people get completely burnt out.
Oh, all the time.
They get severely depressed, they feel defeated by the world, and they withdraw. They stop hustling at work. They stop seeking relationships. They might just sit on the couch all day staring at the wall.
Right.
From the outside, or even to themselves, they might think, I've finally let go of my desires. I've achieved a kind of stoic detachment.
But the framework looks at that depressed, withdrawn person and says they haven't found peace at all. They haven't achieved ego thinning. They have simply run out of gas.
The tank is empty.
The engine, the mechanical structure of the ego, is exactly the same.
Yeah.
The intent of the machine hasn't changed. It's just sitting idle in the driveway with an empty tank. And how do we know this?
How?
Because if you poured just a little bit of desire back into that person's tank, say, a sudden guaranteed opportunity for massive fame, or an email from someone they are desperately in love with, that seemingly detached engine would roar back to life with the exact same viciousness and anxiety as before.
That is a devastating critique of how we view burnout. We think we're making progress because we stopped running, but the treadmill is still plugged in.
Exactly.
The withdrawal of the depressed person and the manic 80-hour-week activity of the achiever are just two poles on the same flat horizontal sheet. To achieve true vertical movement, you don't just park the car. And you certainly don't just change the fuel from worldly desires to spiritual desires. You have to fundamentally dismantle the engine itself.
Which means we need to deeply understand the components of this machine. If we want to dismantle the engine of suffering, we have to know how it works. And more importantly, we have to stop blaming the wrong suspect for our misery.
And that leads us to a massive paradigm shift in the text. This was the part of the source material that really stopped me in my tracks. We are moving into the framework's anatomy of the human operating system, the innocent machine, the weaponized body, and the myth of pure consciousness.
This section is incredibly clarifying, especially when you think about how we talk about our own psychology in the modern world. We go to therapy, we meditate, and we constantly complain about our minds.
Yeah, we blame our minds for everything.
But the framework draws a hard, foundational distinction that changes everything. The mind and the ego are not the same thing.
This is huge because we constantly say things like, my mind is racing, or my mind is torturing me today, or I need to conquer my mind. We treat the mind like it's this malicious entity living in our skulls.
Right? Like an enemy.
But the framework says the mind is completely innocent. It is just a biological machine made of two primary components, memory and intellect. It's exactly like computer hardware, a hard drive and a processor. It doesn't desire, it doesn't fear, it doesn't resist, and it doesn't plot against you.
It goes even further. It describes the brain as the evolutionary representative of the entire universe within the human body.
Wow.
Left to its own devices, without the ego interfering, the brain and body operate with a natural, almost miraculous intelligence and economy. The intellect is just a neutral tool for processing relationships between objects, calculating distance, solving a math problem, figuring out how to build a shelter.
And memory is just the hard drive.
Memory is just a neutral biological record of sensory data and events. But here's the tragedy. The ego commandeers the mind. It is a hijacker that breaches the cockpit and takes over the innocent hardware.
So the ego is the malware?
Exactly. The ego takes the memory, which should just be a factual database, and infects it. It turns memory into a selectively edited autobiography, where you are always the central character, usually the misunderstood hero or the tragic victim.
Oh, that's so true. We rewrite history to make ourselves look right.
Always. And it takes the intellect, that beautiful neutral processing tool, and turns it into a relentless justification machine. The intellect is put to work defending the ego's fragile scaffolding, arguing for your limitations, and generating complex rationalizations for why you lashed out at your partner. The intellect isn't flawed, it's just working for a corrupt boss.
And the text points out that the ego's hijacking doesn't just stop at mental processes. The ego can literally weaponize the physical body as a defensive tool. This was one of the most aha moments for me reading this.
Okay.
The mechanism described is so deeply relatable.
Let's talk about it.
Like, you sit down to read a really challenging book, maybe a dense philosophical text like the one we're discussing, something that threatens your worldview or points out your deepest flaws. You slept 8 hours, you had coffee, you feel totally fine. You read 2 pages, and suddenly you feel overwhelmingly, paralyzingly drowsy. Your eyelids feel like lead. You physically cannot keep your eyes open.
We've all experienced that.
Yeah.
And we usually just think, oh, I guess I'm tired, I should take a nap.
Right.
But the framework exposes the mechanism behind this. That isn't the body being genuinely biologically fatigued.
Yeah.
That drowsiness is the ego identifying a lethal threat to its scaffolding.
The book is a threat.
The text you're reading is threatening to dismantle the ego's illusions.
Yeah.
Since the ego cannot physically fight a book, it places a physiological requisition order with the nervous system. It sends a distress signal, threat detected, shut down the processor. The innocent brain complies by inducing drowsiness to force you to drop the book, allowing the ego to escape the threat.
So my tiredness in that moment is literally a psychological defense mechanism manifesting biologically.
Yes. Distraction, sudden hunger when you sit down to meditate, a phantom itch, an overwhelming urge to check your email right when you are about to have a difficult but necessary conversation. These are very often the ego deploying the body as a shield.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to push back on this idea of the innocent mind.
Okay, let's hear it.
If my mind is just a neutral biological machine, an innocent processor who is keeping me awake at 2 a.m. overthinking a weird email I sent to my boss, if the mind doesn't fear, what the hell is happening in my head when my heart is pounding in the dark?
What is happening is that the hijacker is driving the bus and it's redlining the engine. When you are lying awake at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, your mind isn't sick. The ego is using the mind's intellect to project catastrophic future scenarios.
But losing my job, ending up broke.
Right. Why? Because the ego scaffolding your professional identity, your need to be seen as competent, feels severely threatened by that email. And the ego is simultaneously forcing the mind's memory drive to pull up every other time you felt embarrassed or failed, to prove to you that the threat is real.
So the mind is just obediently running the terrifying simulations the ego ordered it to run.
Precisely. And this is why so many modern approaches to treating mental distress ultimately fail. We try to treat the mind. We try to force the mind to be quiet through sheer willpower, or we try to manage its symptoms.
But the mind isn't the patient.
No, the ego is the hijacker. If you treat the symptoms, if you find a way to temporarily sedate the anxiety but leave the ego's fragile, demanding structure totally intact, you haven't solved anything. You've just sedated the hijacked hostages while the terrorist is still sitting comfortably in the cockpit waiting for the sedatives to wear off.
That is an incredibly powerful way to frame it. You can't heal the hardware if the malware is still running the show. Now, as if redefining the mind and the ego wasn't enough, the framework goes even further into the deep end of ontology here, tackling the nature of consciousness itself.
Yeah, this gets deep.
It states categorically that consciousness is inherently dualistic. By definition, there is always the ego on one end and an object on the other. You are always conscious of something.
This is a critical pivot. If we connect this to the bigger picture of global spirituality, this is where the AP framework radically departs from and actually attacks classical non-dualism.
Like Advaita Vedanta.
Right, or popular modern mindfulness teachings. The pervasive idea is that behind your noisy, messy ego, there's a pristine, true self, a witness or pure awareness. In Sanskrit, it's often called a sakshi. The promise is that if you can just quiet the mind and dissolve the ego, you fall back into this beautiful, peaceful, eternal state of pure, observing consciousness. You become the silent witness to the universe.
But the AP framework rejects this completely. It literally calls the witness the ego's last, most desperate refuge.
It demolishes the concept. It argues that there is no true self or pristine awareness hiding behind the ego. The ego is the surface, and there is no hidden depth behind it. Consciousness is a function of the ego interacting with the world. Therefore, if the ego actually dissolves, consciousness as we experience it completely ceases.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand this because it feels completely counter to everything we're taught in, like meditation apps. Are you saying the idea of the witness is just a trick the ego plays on itself?
Yes, the ego is terrified of its own non-existence. The idea of true dissolution, true ego thinning, is essentially death. So the ego invents a brilliant spiritual loophole.
The loophole?
It says, okay, I will pretend to let go of my worldly attachments, and I will dissolve my everyday ego, but only on the condition that I get to stick around as pure awareness to enjoy the peace. It wants to survive its own funeral by claiming to be the eternal observer of the funeral.
Wow.
The framework says no. That witness is just the ego wearing a very subtle, very spiritual disguise.
I'll let go as long as I get to be the one watching myself let go. It's so insidious. And the framework doesn't stop at psychology. It drops an absolute ontological bombshell here about the physical universe itself. It claims that an unspoken of universe is a non-existing universe.
This is where the framework requires intense philosophical focus. It argues that the 3D geometry of the universe, the very way we perceive space, time, up, down, objects, and distance, corresponds precisely to the 3D geometry of the human body doing the perceiving.
Right.
Without the physical ego, the skin boundary, the binocular vision, the sensory organs, the universe loses its perceptible form.
Hold on. Let me push back hard on this because it sounds dangerously close to solipsism. Are you saying that if humanity goes extinct tomorrow, the Andromeda Galaxy ceases to exist? Because that sounds absurd. The universe was here for billions of years before biological egos evolved to look at it. How does the text defend that?
It's not solipsism, which says only my mind exists. It is an epistemological limit. The framework isn't saying the physical matter of the universe vanishes into a void. It is saying that the universe as a structured geometric reality, the universe of stars, galaxies, distances, and shapes, is a co-creation.
A co-creation between us and what's out there.
Yes. It is a locked relationship between the perceiving biological ego and whatever is out there. You cannot step outside your biological ego to verify what the universe looks like without you, because the moment you step outside, the knower is gone.
Right. There's no camera to record it.
Reality is the interface between the ego and the unknown. No physical ego means no consciousness, which means no universe as we can possibly conceptualize it. The ego is literally holding the shape of reality together.
It's staggering to think about. It decenters everything. So if there is no pristine true self waiting for us like a hidden treasure, and if achieving pure consciousness is a myth, and if enlightenment as a final permanent state is an impossible contradiction as long as we have a physical body, then what exactly is the goal of all this?
That's a fair question.
Like, if we are biologically trapped in this ego structure, why do the work? This leads us into the heart of the text, the pathless path, and the formula for genuine change.
The framework's claim here is stark, but honestly, once you accept it, it's a massive relief. Enlightenment as a final destination, a finish line you cross where you never suffer again, is a structural impossibility. As long as the body breathes, the ego floor is there.
Right, you still have to eat.
Think about the logic. The person who stands up and declares, "I am enlightened," is caught in a hilarious self-refuting contradiction. The declaration is being made by an I. It's the ego proudly waving its own death certificate. Therefore, liberation isn't a destination you arrive at and set up camp. It is a direction.
A direction of continuous, unending movement, and the formula the framework provides for this vertical movement is deceptively simple. Change equals seeing plus intent.
Change equals seeing plus intent. Let's break those two components down very carefully.
Okay, let's start with seeing.
First, seeing. Seeing means the direct, unflinching apprehension of what is actually happening in your inner world, without the ego jumping in to interpret, justify, or create a victim narrative. It's looking at your own sudden flare of jealousy or your own manipulative behavior and just seeing it. Not immediately making an excuse for it, not blaming your partner for triggering it, just observing the mechanism at work.
And this is a massive, but seeing isn't enough on its own. The text explicitly calls out famous spiritual teachers here, particularly J. Krishnamurti.
Yes, Krishnamurti was very famous for this.
Right. He taught that choiceless awareness or pure seeing was enough. He argued that if you just observe your fear totally, the seeing itself acts as a fire that burns the fear away. The AP framework strongly disagrees.
And we see why the framework disagrees in everyday life. We all know people, maybe we are these people who go to years of therapy.
Yeah.
They can see their own toxic patterns with crystal clarity. They have neat psychological labels for their trauma. They know exactly what their triggers are, and they can articulate their neuroses beautifully.
Oh yeah, I know plenty of those people.
But they don't change. They just gracefully incorporate their seeing into their life and keep acting out the exact same destructive patterns. The ego is highly adaptable. It can turn seeing into just another piece of scaffolding. I am a very self-aware neurotic.
That is so true. Knowing a cigarette is killing you doesn't magically make you drop the cigarette. That's why the second half of the equation is the engine of actual change, intent. Intent is the ego's active, agonizing choice to move against its own self-preserving grain. It's the choice to let the scaffolding fall rather than defending it. And the text makes a vital distinction here. Intent is not willpower.
This is where most self-improvement goes wrong. Willpower is the ego fighting inward externalized projection. I am going to use my immense willpower to fight my bad habit of eating sugar.
Right, making sugar the enemy.
That keeps the ego totally intact. It actually inflates the ego by making it a heroic warrior fighting a battle against the evil sugar. Intent is entirely different. Intent is the ego fighting itself. It is the choice to dissolve.
But wait, this brings up the most glaring logical paradox in the entire framework. If the ego's entire default setting, born from millions of years of evolution, is self-preservation, defending its boundaries, and scaffolding at all costs, how can it possibly generate the intent to dissolve itself? Isn't that like asking a computer virus to sit down and write code to delete itself? Where does the intent come from if the ego is the only thing there?
This raises an important question, maybe the most important question of the deep dive. And the text addresses it through what it calls the bootstrapping resolution. The text posits that the ego doesn't just have one constitutional drive. It actually has two conflicting drives operating simultaneously.
Two drives, okay.
Yes, it has the massive biological drive for self-preservation. It wants to survive and build scaffolding. But deep down, fundamentally, it also has a constitutional drive for self-dissolution.
Why? Why would it want to die?
Because the ego constantly feels the agony of its own incompleteness. It suffers under the suffocating weight of its own scaffolding. It is exhausted by the relentless need to defend itself. At its absolute core, it remembers the baseline incompleteness, and it wants freedom from itself. It wants to be relieved of the burden of being X.
So the human condition is a literal internal war. Half of us wants to build thicker, higher walls to feel safe, and the other half is desperately trying to tear the house down so we can finally see the sky and breathe.
Precisely. And in this framework, the word love is defined very specifically and very unromantically. Love is not an emotion or a warm feeling towards someone else. Love is the continuous, grueling inner strife of choosing the drive of self-dissolution over the drive of self-preservation, minute by minute, day after day.
And the most sobering, perhaps terrifying part of this formula is the absolute emphasis on sovereignty. The text is utterly brutal about this. A great teacher, a profound book, a devastating life event, these external things can provide a mirror. They can force you to see. But the intent, that must come from within you. No one can force you to let go of your ego. The universe is not going to swoop in and save you.
It strips away all of our favorite excuses. You are not waiting for a cosmic trigger. You are not waiting for the grace of a guru. You are not waiting for the perfect astrological alignment or the right therapeutic breakthrough. You are waiting for yourself. You have absolute terrifying sovereignty over your own direction.
Which brings us to the messy practical application. It's one thing to talk about continuous self-dissolution in theory, but we still have to wake up on Wednesday, go to work, interact with difficult people, and process the pain of existence. How does this ongoing war of intent actually play out in our daily lives? We mentioned earlier that we have to get off the horizontal treadmill, but we still have to act in the world. We can't just lay on the floor. How do we take action without pouring desire fuel into the icy engine?
The text navigates this through the concept of nishkama karma. This is originally a concept from the Bhagavad Gita, meaning action without desire or attachment to the fruit of the action. But the AP framework gives it a very precise mechanical, psychological articulation. It contrasts two ways of moving through the world, why-ness versus I-amness.
Explain the grammar of why-ness, because that seems to be how 99% of humanity operates.
Almost all our actions live in the grammar of why-ness. I do this because I want that. I am going to the gym because I want to look attractive. I am being nice to my boss because I want the promotion. There is a backward linkage, the initial lack or desire, and a forward linkage to the anticipated reward that will fix the lack. The action itself is just a miserable bridge between the lack and the reward.
But ego-thin action, action on the vertical axis, arises purely from I amness.
Yes, you act not as a desperate means to an end, but as a sheer expression of your center. The action is complete in itself the exact moment it is performed. If you act from I amness, if the action is just an expression of your deepest truth in that moment, you cannot be disappointed by the result. Why? Because you weren't acting for the result. You kept no accounts. You didn't expect the universe to pay you back.
Speaking of keeping accounts, we have to talk about how this framework handles pain and trauma, because this is where it gets incredibly provocative. The text introduces the concept of the ledger, but first it draws a hard, non-negotiable line between pain and suffering.
This is vital. Pain is physical, physiological, and honest. You stub your toe, it hurts. You experience a biological loss, a sickness, it hurts. The nervous system reports damage, and then as the body heals, the pain naturally subsides. Pain is a fact of the ego floor. But suffering. Suffering is the ego's manufacturing plant. Suffering is pain multiplied by resistance, plus a victim narrative, plus identity.
And this leads to the concept of the strategic freeze. A framework looks at trauma and distinguishes between a genuine freeze and a strategic freeze. A genuine freeze is neurological. The nervous system is completely overwhelmed by an event. The body is literally biologically immobilized. An external intervention like a medical doctor or a somatic therapist is absolutely required to reset the nervous system.
But strategic freeze is entirely different. This is a psychological maneuver. This is when the biological event has passed. The ego has the capacity to move on, but it consciously or subconsciously chooses not to. It acts as a cynical business person. It actively maintains the suffering. It holds tightly onto the trauma identity to keep a compensation claim open against the universe. It keeps the ledger open.
The ledger. Yeah.
It says, look at what my parents did to me. Look at what my ex did to me. I am fundamentally broken and the world owes me special treatment, excuses, and pity because of it. The ego in a strategic freeze weeps not because it was hurt in the past, but because it feels it hasn't been paid adequately for the hurt yet.
Okay, stop right there. I have a real problem with the term strategic freeze. I can imagine a lot of listeners hearing this and getting angry. Telling someone who has been through severe emotional abuse that they are strategically maintaining their trauma to get psychological payout sounds incredibly harsh. It sounds exactly like victim blaming. Where is the compassion in telling a suffering person that they are acting like an accountant with a ledger?
It absolutely sounds harsh, and the framework anticipates this resistance. But it resolves it by expertly surgically delineating between mercy versus compassion. In our culture, we confuse the two. Mercy is validating the sufferer's reality. When someone is in a strategic freeze, mercy acknowledges their pain, offers them a warm blanket, listens to their victim narrative, and tries to make them feel comfortable inside their trauma identity. Mercy is undeniably kind, but it leaves the person trapped in the false scaffolding of, I am a broken victim.
It's treating the symptom but ignoring the disease. It's making the prison cell more comfortable.
Exactly. Compassion, on the other hand, is radical. True compassion addresses the root structural error. It sees straight through the sufferer's false ego. It knows with absolute certainty that the person is not the fixed, broken, traumatized identity they believe themselves to be. Its action, therefore, is to demonstrate to the sufferer that their egoic prison is an illusion. It forces the mirror onto them, sometimes aggressively, to facilitate their actual freedom. It doesn't validate the ego's ledger, it snatches the ledger away and tears it up. In this framework, refusing to indulge someone's egoic suffering is the highest, most profound form of care.
That makes a lot of sense, even if it's hard to swallow. Mercy gives you a comfortable chair in your cell. Compassion takes a sledgehammer to the lock on the door, even if the sound of the metal breaking startles you. And this radically reframed perspective also changes how we process loss and grief. The text contrasts egoic grief with tenderness.
Yes, most of what we call grief is egoic grief. It is mourning your own reduction. This person belonged to me. They padded my scaffolding. They made my life feel meaningful, and now they're gone, so I am diminished. It's secretly selfish. It's grief turned entirely inward toward the ego's loss of a possession.
But tenderness is different.
Tenderness is honoring the reality of what dissolved your ego. What a beautiful being they were. Being near them thinned my ego. It made me forget myself. The best way to honor their existence is not to build a heavy, agonizing monument to my own suffering, but to allow myself to be dissolved further by their memory.
It changes the entire texture of human experience. It even redefines joy. In the AP framework, joy isn't the absence of pain. It isn't the fleeting high of winning the lottery or getting a promotion. Joy is the ego's active elation at its own thinning. It is the ego's party at its own funeral. You can be experiencing intense physical pain or navigating a difficult life situation and still experience profound joy because you feel the heavy scaffolding of your false identities dropping away.
With this radical toolkit, seeing the ego as a structural error, stepping off the horizontal treadmill, closing the ledger of suffering, and choosing the inner war of intent, we can start to see why this framework is so disruptive. It completely dismantles almost every popular self-help, therapeutic, and spiritual movement of our time.
Which brings us to the final major section of our deep dive, the ultimate rebellion and rejecting the fix. The AP framework is uncompromising in its rejection of prescriptive traditions. If a spiritual system gives you a step-by-step path, a specific sapana, a 10-day silent retreat protocol, an app that tracks your mindfulness streaks or progressive stages of meditation, the framework rejects it. Why? Because the ego that sits down to meditate is still the exact same ego. The ego that successfully completes 10 stages of spiritual purification is still the ego. It just has a shiny, highly resistant, new spiritual self-image to be proud of.
Look at me, I'm so detached. I meditated for 2 hours today. I am so much more mindful than my coworkers. It's just new, incredibly stubborn scaffolding. The ego loves spiritual progress because it's the ultimate horizontal movement disguised as vertical lift.
The framework also explicitly attacks what it calls the Neo-Advaita bypass. This is a very trendy, modern spiritual idea you see a lot online. It's the teaching that says, hey, there is no ego. You are already enlightened. There is nothing to do, nowhere to go. Just relax and realize you are already free.
The framework views that as the ego's most sophisticated, dangerous evasion. Yes, the ego is structurally an error, an illusion, but an error has massive operational consequences. If there's a glitch in a plane's software, you don't just say, the glitch isn't real, just relax while the plane is nosediving. Telling a struggling, heavily scaffolded ego that it's already free doesn't magically dissolve it. It just gives it a highly defensive new identity, the identity of the enlightened person who knows there's nothing to do. It's a massive bypass of the actual work. The framework insists the war is continuous. You have to actively fight the self-preserving drive every single day.
It even goes after foundational Western psychology. It critiques Jungian psychology, which talks about integrating your shadow and balancing your archetypes to become a whole, individuated true self. It critiques existentialism, which demands that you live with radical authenticity and create your own intense meaning. The framework looks at all of this and says this is just ego fattening with a better vocabulary.
Exactly. There is no whole true self to build or integrate. The goal isn't to construct a better, more authentic, fully actualized ego. The goal is a thinner ego. The goal is less of you. It even redefines the concept of creativity, which we usually worship as the ultimate expression of the self. True creativity in this framework isn't about expressing your unique, authentic, quirky personality. True creativity is creating without a creator. It's the momentary absence of the ego claiming authorship of the art. The art flows through the biological machine, but there is no I standing there saying, look at what I made.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. So what does this all mean? If I can't meditate my way out of it using a technique, because the meditator is the ego, and I can't logic my way out of it because the intellect is hijacked, and I shouldn't go to therapy to build a better ego, and I can't just pretend I'm already free. It sounds like trying to use any technique or method to kill the ego is like trying to wash dirt off your hands using muddy water. The tool you are using is made of the very substance you are trying to get rid of. So what is actually left?
What's fascinating here is what the framework relies on entirely, the via negativa, or the negative path. It defines the highest ideals strictly by what they are not. In Sanskrit, there's a famous, beautiful phrase, Satyam Shivam Sundaram, truth, auspiciousness, and beauty. The framework redefines these entirely through the negative. It says truth is simply not false. It is exactly what remains in the room when the ego finally stops lying. Beauty is not ugly. And ugly is defined as anything distorted by the ego's grasping touch. So beauty is just reality encountered directly, without the ego trying to possess it or use it. There is no positive, glowing, hidden treasure waiting for you to find at the end of a spiritual journey. There is only the beautiful, quiet absence of the one who is suffering.
That is hauntingly beautiful. The treasure is just the absence of the sufferer. But practically, day to day, how do I achieve that absence if all methods are muddy water?
It brings it directly back to you, the listener, and your absolute sovereignty. You don't need a complex 10-step plan. You don't need to fly to a silent retreat in India. You don't need to shave your head. What the framework prescribes is a relentless, lifelong practice of what it calls honest catching.
Honest catching. Literally just catching yourself in the act of being the ego.
Exactly. You are at your computer, your ego feels threatened by a colleague, and you are about to hit send on a defensive, passive-aggressive email. And in that split second, you catch yourself.
Oh.
There is the ego defending its scaffolding. There is the biological fear manifesting as professional pride. You don't judge it, because judging it is just the ego creating a new identity as the failure. You don't fight it with willpower. You just see it honestly, clearly, and you apply the intent to not feed it. You delete the email. You're about to hold a grudge to keep your ledger of suffering open, and you catch yourself over and over and over again, thousands of times a week. Every time you honestly catch yourself and refuse to act from whiness, you weaken the ego's conviction by a tiny microscopic fraction. You don't gain a permanent stage of enlightenment, you just gain a fraction of thinness. But that fraction, repeated across a lifetime, is the only liberation that is actually real.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and recap this incredible, intense journey we've been on. We started by completely redefining the problem. We learned that the ego isn't just arrogance, it's our foundational sense of I, born from our physical skin boundary and constantly padded with borrowed precarious scaffolding. We learned that we have to step off the horizontal treadmill, the lie that accumulating worldly or spiritual achievements will ever bring us peace, and instead seek vertical freedom through ego thinning. We cleared our innocent minds of the charges against them, realizing that our intellect and memory are just hardware hijacked by the egosphere. We embraced the painful but liberating truth of tearing up our internal ledger of suffering, choosing the sledgehammer of compassion over the warm blanket of mercy. And finally, we accepted that there is no final triumphant state of enlightenment, only the continuous, loving inner war of ego thinning through honest catching.
It is a framework that strips you of absolutely all your comforting illusions. It takes away your victimhood, your spiritual pride, and your hopes for a permanent fix. But in doing so, it hands you back your absolute sovereignty. You and only you can choose to look in the mirror.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today as you re-enter the world. It builds on that ontological bombshell we discussed earlier about the physical ego and the universe. Remember, the framework states that reality only exists for an ego, and unspoken of universe is a non-existing universe. As you go about your day today, I want you to stop and just look at the physical space around you. Look at the room you are sitting in right now. The 3D geometry of that room, the way the light hits the walls, the distance between you and the door, all of that is completely dependent on the shape and location of your physical ego, your sensory organs. Your ego is literally geometrically holding the perceptible shape of your universe together. So ask yourself, what happens to your reality in that split-second moment of honest catching when the psychological ego completely drops away? If you want the ego in that moment, who is looking out of your eyes in that silence?
A profound, unsettling, and beautiful question to take with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining your scaffolding, keep catching yourself in the act, and keep questioning the lens through which you view the world. We'll see you next time.